to do this, and Eliza and Ellen for the logistics and everything. And thanks to Orit, who has agreed to be facilitator here. Thanks to Stephanie and Karen, which you'll be hearing from soon. So I guess I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint here. Hopefully you're seeing it now. Just nod with your head. Okay. So I'll just say a couple of words, general words about what this webinar is about, and then we'll just jump into Jason and myself's presentation. So this is the title of a book, which you might find it hard to see right now, that was published in 2020, Exploring Self Toward Expanding Teacher Education and Practitioner Research. And the presentation that we'll be giving today, the webinar itself, it has the presentation by myself and Jason, which we kind of combined together. Then Stephanie Pinniger will give a presentation about the chapter that she authored together with Marilyn Hamilton for that book. And then Karen Raghunathan, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, will also give a presentation, but that will be a recorded presentation. She might be back in for Q&A at the end, hopefully. So moving on to our presentation. So here we have, basically we're going to speak about the paper that Julian mentioned that we authored together. Then we'll speak a bit about another paper that we authored together, which Jason will present. And then we'll say something about the book, because these two papers are pretty much good openers for this whole theme that the book speaks about. And they also offer the justification for studying this theme of self within self-study, which paradoxically is not studied enough. I mean, that's pretty much my message here, and I'll be speaking about that. So this first paper that we authored, which called, well, I can't see what's going on here, Expanding the Place of Self Through an Autoethnography of Discontents. This paper describes my encounter with the self-study SIG in ARA 2018. I mean, I've been around AR for quite some years, since about 2010, and very much studying the self in various ways, as I'll describe in a moment. But unfortunately, I kind of missed that SIG. So I had very high expectations when I saw a SIG that handles the kind of turf that I thought I was handling. So this is a quote from my field notes, which appears in the paper, and it says this: "This is the third session I'm attending in this ARA SIG called self-study. I'm hearing selves presenting, but I have yet to hear anything about self. Am I misinterpreting the term self-study? What do they mean by it, if not the study of self? I guess I need to do my homework here and read some of the published work to figure out what's going on here." So that's kind of my perplexed feeling as I went into these sessions expecting certain things, but getting something quite different, which I didn't understand. And then I heard Jason speak, and I kind of heard some kind of a critical perspective on things that were happening there in the discourse. And I said, okay, I need to speak with this guy after ARA, and that's what I did. And things started to happen from there, I guess. I mean, some papers and books and stuff. So this particular paper follows my reading of the discourse in light of my background. So I'll begin by saying some things about my own background. My career is about the practical and theoretical exploration of the place of contemplative practices like yoga, tai chi, mindfulness, meditation in education and teacher education. So just to provide, there's someone who might help us by putting on mute his mic. I don't know who that is, but maybe some, okay. So just to give you a definition of what contemplative practices are, I mean, there are many definitions out there, but this is one that I like because it's very broad. It says that these are ways that human beings across cultures and time have found to concentrate, broaden, and deepen conscious awareness as the gateway to cultivating their full potential and to leading more meaningful and fulfilling lives. It's very broad, and I'm not going to get too deep here into this, but there's a very fundamental act in contemplative practices, which is when we practice contemplation of various forms, we turn our attention in. Turning our attention in means studying ourselves in various ways, and there are multiple ways of doing that. But that's the fundamental act there. You turn your attention inward. In my courses in Teacher Ed, which I've been teaching for, I don't know, over a decade, they focus on learning to practice mindfulness practice and various other contemplative practices as a means for enhancing their connection with who they are, for exploring who they are. And that's kind of the basis that I see them as necessary for them to go into classrooms teaching whatever discipline they teach. I mean, and I'm not, this is not new, of course. I mean, Robert Bullo has spoken about it. Fred Kortagin has spoken about these things. Kurt Kelchtermans. There are various scholars who are engaged in self-study who spoke about these themes. In my case, it's pretty much the core of what I do. So coming from this background and having been a practitioner of mindfulness, yoga, and other practices for many years, in which the self is pretty much the theme, I came to self-study expecting to find other people who are doing similar things. But that's not what I found. So I said, okay, I'm going to start reading what's going on here. So I started reading papers published by Stephanie Pinniger, Hamilton, and various other scholars who were kind of initiated this discourse. And my conclusions were that there's some kind of an apologetic tone in this discourse whenever it gets to actually turning our gaze inwards, which, you know, I'm a proud navel gazer, I must say. So I said, why is that a problem? And I always found these statements like, although the term self-study suggests a singular and individual approach, you know, and then kind of you have to apologize if you do such things. We're not individualists, we're not singular and all that. And there are other similar statements that are cited in my paper, in our paper there. And so there's this fear of being labeled as navel gazers. Now, of course, navel gazing in the sense of, you know, being solipsistic, being escapist, being narcissist, I completely agree with that. But there's a false conclusion here that if you turn your gaze inwards, the result is being an escapist. I mean, and that's pretty much something that we need to think about. So I understand why self-study scholars don't want to be considered navel gazers. Of course, we're speaking about teaching, and there's this whole ethical commitment to students. So it sounds as if engaging in such practices would be, you know, the kind of the wrong way to do it. You should gaze outside and explore, you know, and be very relational. But I'll get into this a little like in the next slide, but this whole thing about turning our gaze in, I mean, there's a whole relationship going on there, which is not quite considered. So I'll speak about that in a moment. There's another aspect that I saw as kind of eroding the status of self in the discourse, which had to do with the need to embrace critical friends. And I know that there are definitely studies in this method that do not use critical friends. But in some cases, as I read critical friendship, it sounded to me like we need some external legitimacy to our own selves. It felt to me like, again, some kind of an apology. It also had to do with somehow elating the status of this kind of methodology, which relies on self, and we still want to sound like academics who are far more objective than that. The places from which I come, all these contemplative practices that I've been practicing, studying, teaching, and so forth, they don't have that problem. You see, because when you learn to practice contemplative practices seriously, what you actually develop over time is a stronger sense of this more objective tone that you can produce through that practice and through your things. And I'm not saying that having another eye external that would check what you do and someone to discuss with is wrong or anything of that sort. And I'm all for that. I'm just saying that we can certainly rely on ourselves if we educate ourselves in various ways to practice and understand ourselves through these practices. So to me, all these kind of things pull away from attending seriously to self in its own terms. And I set aside teaching because there's a lot of value to these practices for teaching, which I won't get into too much here, which are important for themselves. The other aspect here is, which pretty much is the crux of the matter, is the whole domain of the ontology of self. When we speak of ontology of self, what we mean is studying questions like, who is the self that engages in self-study? Who is that person? Who and what is it in relation to? What are the implications of different ontologies of self to life and to teaching? And I want to cite Finnegar and Bull on this because they said that the consideration of ontology should be a central feature of any discussion of the value of self-study research. But you find very little of that. That at least I found, and Jason, we found little of these kind of discussions in the discourse, and we wonder why. So to sum up my statement here, and Jason is going to reiterate these conclusions because the paper that he's first author on also reiterates these things from his perspective. So in terms of the ontology of self, we mostly see an ontology that discusses self and world. So it's a relational self. Contemplative practices introduce the possibility of self-self. What does self-self mean? It could mean various things. And there are various renditions of this kind of self. It could be James's I and me. There's Antonio Damasio, who speaks about core and autobiographical self. There's Sean Gallagher, who speaks of narrative and minimal self. It could be a body-mind thing. There are various possibilities that we discuss both in this paper and in the book. As to critical friendship, when you engage in this relation, in this internal domain of self-self, then critical friendship can actually happen in there, within you. I mean, you can be your own critical friend in various ways. And I know I'm just glossing through these things, but they're discussed more in the paper. So a focus on self-love is crucial for teachers and teacher educators and for self-study as a means for liberation for oppression of educational and academic systems. And I elaborate in that paper because oftentimes what happens is that we don't navel gaze, but we social gaze. That is, we engage in the opposite. The systems in which we are situated, often they take hold of our minds and how we think. They construct the ways in which we think, education in which we teach, and we lose our own voice. And I see that recurrently in teachers that come in to my courses, and I feel that they have been deprived of their own voice. I see contemplative practices as a way of bringing back that voice in. And from there, this can certainly work into self-study as a means for exploring ourselves and actually becoming these ethical teachers that we actually hope to cultivate. So from here, I hope that some of these points will be reiterated and clarified through Jason's presentation, but hopefully you might ask later some more. So I turn it on to you, Jason.
All right, thank you very much, Oren. Your friendship and pushing my thinking has been invaluable over the last 3 years. And I think it's a nice reminder to all of us that there's a value in stepping outside of our own bubbles sometimes, because it does force us to think about things in new ways. And so the second paper that we wrote together was recently published in Professional Development in Education. And it was called Being a Fish Inside and Outside the Waters of Self-Study. I start that article with laying out some of the debate. And I think many of you are probably familiar with that, but there's certainly people. I use this Time magazine cover. There's naysayers out there that think self-study is mostly about being self-absorbed, possibly narcissistic. I have become used to citing Sam Weinberg as one example of this. I should probably stop doing it because I am a proponent of self-study. But in an Education Week article back in 2005, he wrote, "Self-study is the way. We can never know too much about our own feelings as researchers, the shades and hues of how we come to formulate our research questions. We must document and write articles about each unfolding second of our practice. We're a fascinating lot, and there's still so much about ourselves we don't know. That actually sounds okay until you realize he is being quite sarcastic. And the title of the article is Maintaining the Vitality of Our Irrelevance, Preparing a Future Generation of Education Researchers. And so obviously that's a downside to it. Now, on the other side, with the trophy, we have one of the best ringing endorsements of self-study with Ken Zeichner's piece, Back in Educational Researcher, where he talks about research about teacher education that's being conducted by those who actually do the work is probably the single most significant development ever in the field of teacher education research. I've been trying to find my way through this debate ever since I've been in higher education. I graduated with my PhD in 2008, and so I'm about 15 years in. And with this article, and with Oren's perspective, I think what we were looking to do was to promote the value of self-study, but simultaneously take a hard look at some of the assumptions and some of the norms that have become common for this type of research. And so one of the things that we do is we use the metaphor of the fish inside and outside the water. I got that idea after I read a commencement speech by David Foster Wallace. In that speech, he basically talks about how there's two young fish swimming along. They happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way. The older fish nods at them and says, "Morning, how's the water?" The two young fish continue to swim along, and then a little bit later down the path, they say, "What the hell is water?" And so to me, I like that story because it makes me think about how we get so accustomed to doing things in certain ways that we don't really question them anymore. And so in the article, we borrow from Thomas Kuhn, from Elliot. Sorry, I think I got muted.
Yeah.
In the article, we borrow from Thomas Kuhn and Elliot Eisner, and we talk about how individuals just become habituated. They become socialized to see things in certain ways, not in others. That certainly applies to academics, where we learn to swim in the waters of our paradigm, where we learn to think about what is acceptable kinds of questions to ask, where we learn to think about how to investigate those questions. And so, Oren, I didn't realize the picture that I picked has you looking like a particularly grumpy fish outside of the water, but that's him there. And then me, I consider myself, when it comes to self-study, as being the fish in the water, but a fish who's still very interested in asking and thinking about questions that maybe are critical to the paradigm itself. And so if you could move to the next slide. With the methodology, well, one thing I meant to say earlier is that I've been doing, the reason I consider myself a fish in the water is I've been doing self-study really as long as I've been in higher ed. 2004 to 2008 was I was in graduate school, and my very first presentation was in 2006 to the self-study SIG. My first article that was published was in 2007 in Studying Teacher Education. And I've done a lot of work in self-study since then. And so I was just interested in really thinking through my process and where I've been and where I've come. And so with the paper, I tried to step back purposefully as it relates to my understanding of self-study. And I did that by writing analytical notes on my past. And so that was my earliest attempts at self-study. I actually did a self-study dissertation. And when I went back and I tried to revisit that, it was very deeply personal, very deeply related to my own journey And I try to look at that with a critical look. I'm now the chair of the Department of Instruction and Leadership and Teacher Education at Duquesne University, and I spent the last 6 or 7 years facilitating a self-study group. And so that 2018 edited book, with some others on this call, we were looking at how do you facilitate self-study with other people. And so I also tried to think about that and how I go about teaching or facilitating self-study with others as part of this article. That was informed by the Lunenburg and Samaras article in Teaching and Teacher Education, where they talk about teaching self-study research carries the risk of becoming technical and losing the self. And so I've been very conscious of how I work with my colleagues to think about self as they try to apply this research methodology. So as I wrote those analytical notes on my past and on my present, I talked with Oren an awful lot over the years, especially valuing his perspective as a so-called outsider to self-study, even though he is very involved in studying self. And that also produced an autoethnography, is what we called it, where we tried to articulate different sources of discontent around the authority of and the focus of self and self-study. The emergent themes I talk about in that article, reframing self-focused, reframing relationality and critical friendship, and reframing improvement aimed. Maybe I shouldn't have used such harsh language as reframing. It's more like, here are some other considerations that maybe the wider community of self-study can engage with and think further through. But one of the things that occurred to me with self-focused, and these are mostly the Lebowski criteria for self-study from the handbook. That's kind of become something that people cite often, and I think it should be. But how we interpret those criteria makes all the difference. And so we know in self-study, self and practice should be considered simultaneously. Now, I do think that there's a risk when we focus too much on practice and not enough on self. So it's about a balance. But when we don't focus enough on self, it can become almost as if we're hollow vessels through which practices flow. And in that case, it's almost like self-study becomes action research for teacher educators. And there's great value in action research. I'm not here to say that that's not a valued approach to research, but I think self-study is different. I think, so like I say here, to swim in the waters of self-study, we have to learn how to apply research methods in a sophisticated way to ourself alongside with practice. We have to ground ourselves in an ontology because that ontology ultimately is how I think we can gauge trustworthiness. It should inform the findings, and it should also be the exact reason that people can ask us questions about how we arrived where we're at. And so mostly in the paper, I ask, Oren and I ask that we consider how self-study can be more self-focused as opposed to just self-initiated with some kind of problem of practice. The second slide is something Oren already spoke on quite a bit, and so I'm not going to belabor that point. I'll just say that I do get a sense, it's been my experience, that more and more we have critical friendship, we have collaborative self-study being considered as the gold standard. And I think there's a lot that other people can bring to our self-studies, but I just don't think it's always necessary. And, Lebowski never wrote it up that way. I just feel like that seems to be where many of the articles I read now are going, that you almost include a critical friend by default. But there is a value. There is a certain kind of importance in opening up an inner relationship. Again, as Oren spoke about, and it can and oftentimes is just as valid, depending on how we frame study, self-studies, as what a critical friend might be able to bring into the picture. And then the last call that I ask people to consider is talking about that improvement aim criteria. Again, I think that is something that's admirable, but I do have to tell you, I started doing self-study in 2004. I went to the University of Georgia, and Todd Dinkelman, who some of you all may know, was my major professor. And I think he just got a sense that I wasn't a very well-established teacher. I've been teaching for 3 years. I certainly wasn't an established teacher educator when I first started. You know how that transition goes. You show up and you're immediately asked to start teaching teachers. Well, it's not that easy. But whenever I was in his first seminar and we were asked to do a research project, he said, why don't you just start writing about your experiences? And I did just that. And it served me very well over the last 15 years to continue to keep track of what I'm doing, what I'm thinking, the new things I'm trying as a teacher educator. But the point is, I didn't know where I was going. And those reflections actually became the first article that I wrote, the 2007 piece in Studying Teacher Ed. And so if I would have went into it with this notion of I have to somehow improve, I'm not sure that I would have had the same realizations that I had, because I was just lost. And sometimes there's a value in that. And so what we talk about at the end of that article is maybe opening self-study up to more of a non-instrumental approach. Certainly looking to improve is something that we're all trying to do all the time, but holding too tightly to that criteria can present problems. Sometimes meaningful insights emerge when we immerse ourselves in an action for its own sake and forgetting the outcome. And so that's the Cliff Notes version of what I talk about in that article. Because of the way that Orrin and I interacted and wrote these things together, we also ended up publishing an edited book, which I will turn over to Orrin to speak about for a little bit, but
all right,
that's it.
So very briefly about the books. Thanks, Jason, and of course the friendship is mutual here. I'm really happy I met you there, ARA 218, and the friendship is going on. It's sometimes critical, but it's mostly just friendship. So the book that was published in 2020, I mean, it combines three emphases. One is about self-study and its relation to self. Then there's the whole theme of the teaching self, who that is, various conceptions of self and the teaching self, and the aspect of contemplative practices, which is more where I come from. So the authors in the book kind of come from these three perspectives, and each one of them, or the groups that wrote chapters, engage this from various perspectives. So there are chapters that come from East Asian traditions, there's continental philosophy, existential psychology, aesthetics, various perspectives from which people describe these themes. And various conceptions of self came up from this. So Julian Kitchen, for example, wrote about the relational self that he's been working on for years. Stephanie, from which you'll be hearing soon, spoke about self as a becoming and the whole relational aspect of self and in-betweenness, the in-between teacher and student, in between researcher and research, and so forth. And there are various other conceptions there that open up possibilities here for discussing the ontology of self. And just a list of the contributors here in the order of the chapters, which you can look at. Various people, some of whom are not from self-study and did not engage in self-study, but they do engage in the study of self from various directions. So from here, I'll pass it on to Stephanie. So I'm gonna release this share, and Stephanie, you're welcome to present. You're on mute, Stephanie. Still on mute. Still on mute. You're still on mute.
Muted twice.
Oh,
So it's okay. Let me share my screen. And there it is. Okay. Just a minute. Am I shared? I can't tell. There. Okay. Before I start, I want to say some things. So first off, you guys started in 2008 and I started in 1996, and I was standing in a different place at a beginning than you were. And I was still entangled in the debates between abstractionist ontology and relational ontology, which there's an excellent article by Brent Slife on that, who is an existential psychologist. But in addition, what I was really concerned about is the kinds of practical knowledge that teacher educators had that were nowhere in the literature. And I was interested in covering that in my own practice and in the practice of other people. So I probably was a lot more self-focused at the beginning than it probably sounds like now. Secondly, I thought it was really interesting what Jason said about improvement aim, because my belief always was that if you really understood yourself and you understood why you were acting as you were, and you gained a refinement of that, then the way in which you dealt with other people and the way in which you taught would shift and improve. Because I've always kind of rejected the whole improvement aim notion too. I just am quiet about it. And then I wanted to point out that one of the reasons why Vicki Lebowski doesn't talk about critical friendship is that she and Mary Lynn had a huge fight about it when she was writing that article, because Mary Lynn and I have always thought the best critical friend is you, and that you're reading, that you should be reading extensively, that you're thinking, that whatever you raise, you should be critiquing whatever you're coming to. And that when we talk about knowing in terms of dialogue, that's a fundamental part of it. The fundamental part of that dialogue is with yourself. And it's with all those voices you carry. In our Arizona group, Karen almost always disagreed with what I said, almost always took me to task. And so even today, when I'm doing self-study work, I hear Karen in my head saying, "What do you mean? That's not the way it is." And so, and other voices besides those. So I totally agree with the issues you're raising. And I think it's just like you say, that sometimes it's easier for those instrumental and sort of fundamental research notions to take root. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And we have recently moved away from what we call visiting teaching, where you go once a month and you deliver a lecture and you talk to the person and then you come back the next month, to a thing called ministering. Well, the problem with ministering is no one knows what to do. And I think that when we move away in real life from amorphous spaces to spaces that have rules, spaces that have rules feel more comfortable. I don't think they're as productive, and I'm not really committed to them. But I've watched that swing across my life in terms of my religious commitments, which I'm sure you don't care about. But anyway, that's where that basis comes from. I don't. So what I'm going to talk about is how I see self-study positioned in the space between and the conundrums of self and other in self-study of practice research as a result. Oh, I can't get my, just a minute, I can't get my slides to progress. There. So I start with this quote from Mary Lynn Hamilton and I in 1998. So we argue that this research occurs in the space between self and other, between autobiography and history, between ontology and epistemology, and we claim ourselves as knowers of this space. And the quote that Oren referred to is one of the points that Bullo made in a chapter we did in the first handbook. And our point was that one of the fundamental themes of self-study that I think is really important that has to do with ontology is you're claiming right up front as yourself as knower. And that you're saying right up front, I'm the person who knows this. I'm the person who's done the interpretation. I'm the person who's acted in that space. And as a result, I have obligations. So first, I asked myself, why self-study of practice? So it's a methodology for all practitioners whose practical knowledge is better studied outside of a modernist epistemology. And I agree with Oren that there are multiple ontologies which are linked to epistemologies, but the research community as a whole, particularly when I started, is completely tied up in a modernist epistemology. And part of what we tried to do was move outside that space so that people weren't always pushing on us the norm curve. That's also why we've embraced dialogue as a method for coming to know, so that we don't get caught up in that modernist hypothesis framework, but that we have other ways of coming to know that occur as we promote ideas and wrestle with them. So it's situated in ontology and committed to exploring practical knowing through inquiry, developing and articulating publicly shared assertions for action and understanding. So because we're standing in that space of openness and uncertainty, then conundrums emerge because of that uncertainty and open space. That space acknowledges the centrality of the self, the vulnerability of the self, and engaging in this process, and a focus on, and this is probably where you guys would disagree, on the particular interrelational ontology. Uncovering our practical knowing using dialogue. See if I can do this. Okay, and so I'm going to talk about the 4 conundrums. The first one is the becoming of self and other. So we stand in ontology examining process, content, context, which is dynamic, not status. I was at a lecture once with a philosopher, and he was talking about, the relation of self and other in doing research. And he said that you couldn't study simultaneously process, content, context. And I was taking careful notes, and I threw my book in the air and I said, I'm out of here, because that's what I do. I simultaneously try to understand process, content, context in a setting where everything is moving, where everything is dynamic. While we're studying it, things shift, change, and transform as we study. And somehow embracing in that space, we have to figure a way to understand what we actually know, what our actions and our thinking reveal about what we know about a particular thing, and then find a way to make sure that we're not being fooled. Because to me, navel gazing is about being fooled. So making sure that we're not being fooled, that we really are seeing what we see. So we seek to capture understandings of our experience as we experience it, and we're always becoming. We're always, Bakhtin talks about stepping into the zone of maximal contact when you're reading a novel, when suddenly something you read throws you into a space where your past comes forward into this present, shifts how you're standing in that present, forces you to reinterpret that past, and then reimagine your future. A profound experience I had like that was I didn't ever think I was my parents' favorite, but I always thought I was their second favorite. And one day I realized I wasn't their second favorite either. And it caused me to reinterpret every experience I'd had in my childhood forward. Now, that wasn't that my parents didn't love me. I just realized I wasn't the second favorite. And that caused me to rethink every experience I'd had with them, where I stood with them in the present, and where our future might go. So an example of this for me is Bullock's work, Understanding Candidates' Learning Relationships with Their Cooperating Teachers, a call to rethink my pedagogy. As a supervisor of pre-service teachers in internship placements, he explores his learning alongside theirs. As part of this process, he revisited his experience as a student teacher, which caused him to call into question both his experience as a student teacher and the ways in which he was imposing what he sort of thinks of as unrighteous authority on the students he's working with. So thus he brought the past, the present, and the future into this zone of maximal contact, and in which he reinterprets his past as a student teacher that alters his relationship with his students in the present, and it leads to him reimagining what his future action might be as a teacher educator. The second conundrum of the self is the research methodology. And this is a place where I think we have to, this goes back to the Bolo quote that Oren used, that I feel like we have an obligation to be really careful about trustworthiness. There's a deepened obligation to demonstrate trustworthiness at every turn. So every part of an article, and this is why I went and read Oren's work, and actually, Jason, I think I was the reviewer on your teacher article. Anyway, and I liked it. So I think that you have your literature review demonstrates your ability to select pertinent ideas and to interpret the literature. And in taking that space, it sets you up as a trustworthy person. When you present the detailed data that you're going to present, when you present your findings, the basis of your lit review is important for establishing you as an interpreter that people can trust. In addition, we have an obligation to be very upfront. It doesn't matter what your data collection is. It doesn't matter what your data analysis is. What matters is that you provide a careful and complete explanation of what you did. And this is really hard because there isn't a lot of space for that in an article, but you have got to be opaque. And you have to finally make sure that the data you collect, the analysis you do, and the answer you provide actually responds to your question. And quite often that's the biggest problem I see when I review articles, that pathway is not clear and not complete. So the other thing I think is really important is that we're creating living educational theory. And it's living because we expect whatever theories we're uncovering, that they should grow and change. That as we bring the self in contact with those, they're going to shift, like the example with Bullock, and that it should live, what we come to understand should live in our own practice. That those things we come to understand should then show up in the way we live teacher education, which may or may not be true. I hope it's true for me, but I don't know. You'd have to ask my students. So the example I give of this is a chapter that we did for Monica Taylor and Leslie Koya. And in it, it's one of the funnest pieces we've done. In it, we start with examples from our letters from our very first article, which we reinterpret 10 years later, and which we then apply a frame of positioning theory and then queer theory too. The point of that, in terms of this research methodology, is that it demonstrates how we can attend to trustworthiness as we provide multiple interpretations of data and re-examinations of experience in relation to the shifts in the theoretical frameworks we choose to apply. Conundrum of particularity and wholeness in knowing the tacit and the practical. One of my questions when I was in grad school was, why doesn't the world go away when we think about it? And that really involved me in thinking about practical knowing. So this is a quote from Appian. You will find parts of the truth along with much error, everywhere and the whole truth nowhere. The deepest mistake, he supposed, is to think that your little shard of mirror can reflect the whole. So, wrong thing. So Appian's quote reminds us first that there's a fluidity in things. There's a fluidity in what we know, and that knowing may never coalesce. And second, the shard of the mirror never reflects the whole back to us. We act in the moment on a totality of practical knowledge. We are not consciously aware of all we act on. That's why we can have, and that goes to the next thing that talks about the deficit and boon of practical knowledge. The deficit is our difficulty in disentangling the particular from that whole. And the boon is that practical knowledge is whole and holds potentially incongruent knowledge together. And this is what I found fascinating the last time I read Polanyi is, am I saying his name right? I often say it wrong. Anyway, reentangling provides a never-ending space for inquiry. That whenever we investigate something and come to know it well, then as soon as we start acting on it, as soon as we start using it, it reentangles with our practical knowledge. And therefore, there's a new thing we can study. And you see that. I think you really see that. You guys have provided a really good example of that as you've talked about your progress, as you've explored the self in knowing. But another example is this one from Koya and Taylor. So this study chronicles their search to explore whether or not the tenets of feminism they espouse are present in their practice. And because this study presents their understanding and action as feminist teacher educators from their earlier through their current practices, the reader is able to look at their personal trajectory of becoming against two wholes, their progress as feminist teacher educator scholars, and the theories of feminist practice. So the fourth conundrum is the ethical. Relationships are fundamental in this research. Because if we're looking at even our understandings of practice, even our understandings of ideas, those are always in relationship, even if just to us. So relationships are fundamental in this research. And because they are fundamental, they are therefore ethical, and ethical concerns emerge and reemerge. There's a dual orientation to relationships to humans and relationships to our practices as teachers and scholars, our relationships to the people who we quote and the readings that we do. An example is a piece by Brandenburg and Gervasoni, and they were confronted with a critical instant in their practice. And so they sought to understand it through the issues of the ethical that were emerging. They generated strategies to address ethical aspects of their work and that emerge and reemerge and sometimes surprise, always demanding attention and response. But as Robin has said, even doing that work, you don't, it's the reentangling. You don't ever resolve that. Whenever you engage, another, ethics emerge. So self-study of practice is always located in this space between self and others, seeking to understand practice. And, I think of practice writ large. I don't think of practice writ small. I think of practice as all those things we do in the positions we take up in our life. So it involves others in the practice, the need to honor the self as well as the other. The conundrum of the ethical is always present. The terrain of self-study of practice research is fraught with challenges, not the least of which have been explored here as the 4 conundrums of the self within this methodology to which researchers and practitioners must respond. Special thanks to all the people who made they told me I had to do this and release these awesome free slides for free. And more importantly to me, for publishing the research on which this presentation is based. Special thanks to Studying Teacher Education since publications Emerald Reside and Springer. Thank you.
Hi, this is Patrick. Stephanie's just finishing up a presentation, so I think she can handle the phone now.
Okay, so I'll try to pull up Karen Raghunathan's presentation. Hopefully you'll manage to hear it. Let's see if that works. So you should be seeing it right now. And she has and in a moment, I'll raise the volume here. Let's see if this works for us. If you hear her well, just nod with your heads. If not, then do something else to make me understand.
Welcome to my presentation, Beyond the Self, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in Action. My name is Karen Raghunathan, and I'm a professor at the University of British Columbia's Okanagan campus in British Columbia, Canada. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am presently on the unceded territories of the Syilx Okanagan people. So I acknowledge my identity as a settler, a racialized woman, living, working, and appreciating the beauty of the unceded lands and territories of the Syilx Okanagan people. Some of my colleagues describe teacher education as preparing new teachers for the full catastrophe of the 21st century. While this is a play on words, reminding us of Kabat-Zinn's full catastrophe of living, there is a grain of truth deeply embedded in this analogy. And it is within the context of my geographic location that I will address the issue of the self within the study of teacher education. Access, equity, and equitable representation are ongoing challenges in teacher education. And while many Canadian teacher education programs identify equity and diversity as key values, these values do not always result in the rates of representation that reflect the student population and, in some cases, education program. Various groups, including first-generation students, students with disabilities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, still remain underrepresented and poorly tracked in many teacher education programs. The land acknowledgement at the beginning of my presentation is an important consideration and acknowledgement of the importance of equity, diversity, and inclusion in action, and in particular in my work and on the campus that I work on at UBC Okanagan. In 2015, the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Indian Residential Schools led to the acknowledgement of the intergenerational impact on the First Peoples of Canada. The TRC's recommendations focus on reconciliation through education and curriculum. This focus has impacted the direction of teacher education programs in local, provincial, and national contexts across Canada. And it is within this context of questioning the past, of redressing historical omissions, and reconciling with the future that identity work comes to the forefront of the Okanagan School of Education's mission as a publicly funded post-secondary institution. Amid this context lies my personal and academic exploration of the self within contemplative practices. I view these practices as nurturing acts of kindness, of compassion, and by cultivating an awareness and of being attention attentive, intentional, and authentic. In my personal and professional actions, I view all of these as touchstones impacting my identity, my way of being, my way of doing, and my day-to-day relationships with colleagues, with students, and with the work that I do. Developing dispositions and attributes like non-judgment, acceptance, and non-striving, all fundamental to mindfulness practices, brings a sense of calmness to my day and to my work and to my personal life. By pausing before responding, I develop habits of minds that support an objective examination of unfolding events. I realize that these dispositions anchored in stillness can be used to success in teacher education. As Forbes states in his analogies of waking up, of growing up, of cleaning up, of showing up, of wising up, and of acting up, we can go beyond the self to engage in mindful social action for justice, working together and developing alliances across class, race, creating healthy, more inclusive, socially just policies, systems that demand universal quality for public education for all. In the context of personal history self-study, which can inform practice in diverse communities, inviting teacher candidates to reflect on their own personal identities and to reconstruct significant life events and to analyze these life events can provide situations and contexts which impact not only identity, but recognize identity, impacting also our knowledge and our practice. This critical consciousness sets the parameters for pre-service teachers as well as service teachers to investigate EDI concerns by setting specific guidelines for carrying out inquiry, by modeling shared narratives of experiences, and by providing exemplars and support for practice and critical reflection of the self, of society, and of the other. I see my work exploring self in teacher education practices as combining mindfulness, self-study, and identity work. These are modes of inquiry that can inform each other by applying different modalities of engaging with ourselves. I view them as particularly relevant for the context in which I teach and learn. Researching personal history can also provide pathways to explore the influence of race, of culture, and of gender on teaching and on learning. Since many of my students accept positions, teaching jobs in either urbanized or international contexts, probing into one's race, gender, positionalities, and the spectrum of intersections becomes an important consideration in teacher education. As a unique form of reflection, personal history self-study can delve into unexamined assumptions, privileges, and beliefs that drive curriculum and assessment. In light of this, exploring the fluidity of identity and self-study provides a suitable lens through which to analyze self-knowledge and its impact on practice in diversified, urbanized, and globalized contexts. Richard and Perkins identified 3 educational practices: looking closely, exploring possibilities and perspectives, and introducing ambiguity as ways of developing mindful dispositions. Along those lines, I posit that the real potential of mindfulness attributes lies in the cultivation and nurturing of observational skills, non-judgmental attitudes, flexible transfer of skills and knowledge to new contexts, the development of deep understanding and empathy, the ability to think creatively and critically. At the heart of this exploration is the journey to self. The authenticity cultivated through mindfulness serves as a basis for my own role modeling in teacher education. So, for example, over the years as a teacher educator, I have always shared my own personal history and my background with my students. So since my own personal history is unique and is quite complex to a certain extent, I always begin my courses by discussing my own multifaceted identity, providing a safe place upon which to listen, to share, and to build our own stories. I recognize that sharing my own personal history in these most intimate moments with my students can provide a safe context in which to discuss race, gender, and social justice. After I present my own personal history, I invite students to reflect on their own histories, their own identities, their own positionalities, and their own intersections. And this is also an invitation to revisit the impact of values, of knowledges, of cultures, of languages that have shaped their own lives in this moment. In keeping with a focus on developing criticality in a progressive scaffolding, I believe that personal history, self-study, and self-knowledge become important pieces in transforming pedagogy and practice. Based on my own experiences with contemplative pedagogy, I posit that mindfulness practices can support this type of critical reflection by providing solid parameters for reflection, for reconstructing significant life events, and for analyzing these circumstances on an ongoing basis. Educators, teachers, pre-service teachers should be able to embark on a path of exploring self and diversity in contemporary schooling, and especially if their instructor models respectful, reciprocal, responsible, and relevant dialogue. To me, the self is deeply situated in the geopolitical, cultural, historical context of our lives. We are shaped by the places in which we live, we work, we play, and by the extent to which we are exposed to the multiplicity of perspectives through authentic, respectful dialogue. Identity flows and adapts to the myriad of our shared and lived experiences. The marriage of self-study, of personal history, and of contemplative pedagogy holds the potential to nurture acts of kindness and compassion through attentiveness, kindness, and empathy. I view what emerges as a fluid, socially, historically situated self, looking deeply into the often omitted and hidden perspectives of the other. These dispositions can support educational professionals navigating the complicated landscape of teaching and learning. To conclude, in the words of Parker Palmer, the challenge of racial and cultural minorities to higher education comes in part from their refusal to accept the validity of the universal tale that does not honor the particularities of their own stories. Feminists and Black scholars, for example, compel those of us who promulgate universal truth to consider the possibility that our superstory has persisted less because of its persuasiveness, but more because of our political power. If there is a valid superstory, it will emerge only as the academy becomes what it is meant to be, but is not yet. A place of true pluralism, where many stories can be told and heard in concert. Thank you for your time and attention.
Okay, I hope you managed to hear that. I don't know how it is on your end. I heard it perfectly, but that's so. I guess we turn to Q&A, right? So, Orit, do you wanna? Orit, do you wanna take over?
I don't know if this is what Helen meant. I think she wanted me to be more on the chat.
Okay, all right.
Well, first, I want to say thank you to the presenters and all of their excellent work and food for thought. And does anyone have anything that comes to mind that maybe they weren't able to put in the chat? Any questions or comments? Right. Well, I had one question, because I was really interested in, or in your idea of self, and we got the two different interpretations of nasal gazing. And I found that really, really interesting because I grew up in the tradition. I say grew up, educated my academic growing up in the tradition that nasal gazing was a negative thing to be avoided. Can you talk a little bit more about your ideas around a new framing of nasal gazing?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So yeah, of course, the common usage of this term navel gazing, it comes with a negative perspective, of course. And but the thing is, I mean, usually it's something that we or people say about people meditating or doing things that are completely self-absorbed, and they label that navel gazing as if the meaning of the act is escaping from the world, being narcissistic, focusing solely on yourself, and so forth. And that's the problem there is that it's just a misinterpretation of the act. It usually comes from people who haven't experienced meditation for enough time. And so when I label myself as a proud navel gazer or something like that, I'm interpreting that in a completely different way, right? And part of this has to do with how we understand that what does being self-centered mean at all? You have to really understand what the self is in order to understand what you are centering on here. So when people say self-centered, they mean a very certain aspect of the self. And actually, when you practices like mindfulness, yoga, and so forth, what you do is you actually penetrate through that certain self that they mean when they self-centered, and you go into places which are completely different, which actually connect you to others in a far deeper way. So that's what I meant by navel gazing in my kind of interpretation. And the thing that I put in opposition to this is that people do not realize that we are shaped by what we attend to. And if what we attend to is constantly out there, then what we are left with is a mind that's pretty much, the mirror image of society. And society sometimes doesn't look too good. So what is the antidote for that is to engage critically with these practices, such as mindfulness and other contemplative practices. And what you do there is you observe yourself as a phenomenon, as a becoming phenomenon, actually. Or maybe there's actually a spectrum of possibilities there, whether you're a becoming thing, or whether you are actually something that's far more constant and you're trying to get to that place, which is more of a kind of a true self. So that's a little bit about that.
And I think Teresa Austin has a question as well.
Okay, in the chat here, or
Raised her hand.
ah,
I
okay.
raised my hand. Sorry. I'm not a fast keyboardist, so it's much easier for me to express myself orally than to type out my question. Thank you so much for very thoughtful presentations. And mine, I really found it thought-provoking, because self-study requires a certain kind of vulnerability that you all shared through your presentations. And I'm wondering, when you share that kind of vulnerability, um, what are some of the ethical issues you faced in making public these self-revealing moments, especially when you're trying to um, have articles published by journals that ask you to remove um, your authorness from the article. So the ethical issues, and then the kind of practical ones that come with being vulnerable.
Stephanie or Jason, do you want to
I don't mind
take?
saying. So I think that Brandenburg and McDonough's book on ethics would be helpful to you. But for me, it is that you have ethical, it's relational. You have ethical obligations to others. You have ethical obligations to the scholarship. You have ethical obligations to yourself. That's one of the things that Sean Murphy really taught me, is that when you're doing this work, sometimes we don't honor the ethical obligations we have to us. And when you talk about vulnerability, I just think that's the thing. If you're going to engage in this work, you're going to be vulnerable.
That's right.
But what Oren said just now is really important, because there's a value of that vulnerability in that you come to understand yourself better. And one of the things for me, I don't know the rest of you, but academia can be a really awful place. And one of the things about engaging in self-study has made me better able to position myself as myself, holding myself in places that are not comfortable, and honor who I am, whether other people honor that or not. And I've had to have, I do teaching English language program, and I've had to say really tough things to students over the years. And in doing that, I'm not perfect, but I've found lots of ways. I've learned a lot about how to say the hard things in a soft way that they hear. And unfortunately, they don't always hear it. And sometimes they just get mad at me. But I still learn to be, to stand in vulnerability, in relationships that are difficult and fraught with challenge. And that comes from self-study.
Mhm.
Well, I was thinking more like so did I cover everything? But
Well,
the final thing is, I think my husband and I have this phrase, and that is, when we read certain work, and I think these pieces by Oren and Jason are part of that, it makes your palms sweat. I think that when you do quality writing, a lot of that criticism backs off.
um,
Because if you do really good work, they just have to acknowledge it.
sure. So how, in the practical side, thank you for sharing that. I'm thinking about people whose stories are not often understood and that can be um, difficult to hear. So it's not only talking about difficult uh, experiences, but also experiences that are not well received in the public. And so to make those public, I think takes a lot of vulnerability. It takes a lot of courage to face that vulnerability. And then when they submit the articles to other journals, not necessarily the journals that you publish in, they're asked to remove the identifying characteristics, which is in essence what a self-study really adds, is all of the identifying contexts and critical um, moments that allow you to make sense. Um, so I'm just wondering how you deal with that. All of the presenters have dealt with it, I'm sure, in some aspect or another.
Well,
Yeah.
you have to, you have to blind articles. Eliza Sean Murphy and I have a piece in TEQ, and when it went out for review, we had to change all of our names in the piece. But then when it was published, our names all went back in. I
Mm-hmm.
think a person who could probably answer this better is Valerie Ellison. And you've done some really tough stuff. And
Thanks for calling me out, Stephanie. Yeah, definitely your question resonates with me, Teresa, in that I have published a fair bit on hard topics. And I think changing the names is a minor consideration,
but telling your story with enough detail that it's coherent makes it possible for those who are familiar with your previous research to identify who the cell is. I mean, I think I would be hard pressed to write a follow-up piece on sexual abuse without people saying, that's that Allison girl again. But, you know, I think you have to tell the story in the detail that's required. I mean, you can't not include the essence of the hard facts, the things that make the story yours, and assume that if you've done what's required in terms of letter of the law, in terms of blind review, changing names, not identifying the institution, that you've done your part. And they should send it out to reviewers who don't know your work intimately so that they can't pin it back to you easily.
You know, early I did a piece on for a book, and I left in a lot of stuff, and someone said to me, how dare you say those kinds of things about your institution and who you are? And I said, nobody ever reads anything. I'm not worried about it. And I'm in the same place. I'm in the same institution as Bob Bolo, and he assigned it as reading in a graduate class. And this whole group of students show up at my door to see if I was emotionally okay. So, but I think most people don't read, so mostly I don't worry about it. But I also would say Valerie's work's really important. And also there's a really interesting article in Studying Teacher Ed by McNeil, where she talks about being an African Canadian in ways that are really stark. And she really is open about her experience. And I know it helped me understand a lot better the faculty of color in my institution.
I think this is a good segue into something that's been happening on the chat. Paraphrasing a little bit, several of the comments is around sort of fluidity and thinking of the self as critical friend, but also self in general, and how self-study allows or encourages this within the institutional process. And I take that as in our universities individually, and also in our process of trying to get published and you know, funding, rewarding, or being punished for that. So I open that up to the presenters as well.
Jason is not here. He had to go to Dean's meeting, just like Julian.
There's a technical question in the chat about the if you could share the presentation. So I saw Oren shared the book.
It's actually the paper. Yeah, I can share the presentation, no problem. Yeah. I don't know in what format you do that on the web, because is this going to be posted somehow, the whole recording? So I guess the presentation can accompany that, the PowerPoint. I don't know.
Also, I do want to remind everyone that this will be posted to the website, and when it's uploaded, then we'll announce that on Twitter and Facebook as well. So you will have access to all of these presentations and the wonderful work that has been done. And with that, I'm going to...
I would love to ask a question, if that's okay.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Oren, I wanted to ask you if you're suggesting to self-study researchers to adapt some of the mindfulness practices, and in what way can it be blended into the study?
Yeah, well, I would be careful in telling people what to do in that sense. I mean, I'm suggesting it's a very good way to explore self, uh, and not just mindfulness, contemplative practices in general. It's a very good way to explore ourselves, and this will play out in various ways in the research, even if you don't mention the whole mindfulness things. Just do it for yourself, and it'll probably create some processes that are new if you haven't been practicing these things. And Karen's presentation at the end, actually, she actually does that. I mean, so she edited a book, I think, with Sean Bullock about mindfulness and self-study. And in her work is different than mine, though, because in her case, it's far more socially engaged. I try in my work, what I do is I try to actually break down this whole society thing. What is society at all? I mean, it's basically a bunch of ideas we have in our minds, which have been planted there in various ways since our childhood that we act upon, and sometimes we act upon without thinking about them too much. Even the notion of what education is has been educated into our minds in various ways. So I see mindfulness as breaking down these concepts in various ways and engaging something deeper in us, which is preconceptual. In Karen's work, mindfulness is far more about diversity, inclusion, about exploring your history. And mindfulness is somewhat of a tool by which you can engage other in an open-minded way. So it's not like these two ways are contradictory or something, or that. It's just different emphasis of what can be done with these practices. But there's a huge potential here, generally for teacher education, but also for self-study.
Thank you. Stephanie, somebody asked about your reference to the novel. You're in mute.
She was asking about Bakhtin, and who's a literary theorist and often used as an educational researcher. And I just always talk about the literature because sometimes people lose track of that. And I've written about it elsewhere. But yeah, it's Bakhtin.
Excellent. And if anyone wants to put links to some of these things in the chat, that would be wonderful. But being mindful of the time, I would like to start our awesome book giveaway. We have 2 books this time to give away from our good friends at Emerald and Palgrave Macmillan. So without further ado, we will start with who has won the book from Emerald. All right, that's my favorite part. It's Kemi Abadayo. I'm sure I butchered that name so terribly, but she will be getting a book from Emerald. So congratulations. All right, we have another one. I just love that. It's Jacqueline Nadio. I'm sorry, Jacqueline. I butcher all of these names, but Jacqueline, we're so excited that you get actually Oren's book. So that will be very exciting. That'll be heading to you. Watch your email for details on that.
Thank you very much. It's Jacqueline Naidu. I'm so excited. And thanks for the wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Helen's put in the chat the website link, the Facebook link, and the Twitter link. These are all ways that you can keep in touch with us. And the recording, once I've cleaned it up a little bit and cut away some of the preamble, that will be going up on our website, stepAERASIG.wixsite.com/step. So
give away this Willow book too. Remember, I told you.
I can't see what book that is.
It's called Essays on Teaching, Education, and the Inner Drama of Teaching, Where
All right.
Troubles Meet Issues. It's a set of essays by Bolo.
All right, so spur of the moment giveaway here to Betty Venter. Once again, butchered the name, but congratulations, Zeddy. You'll be getting Bob Bolo's book, and you'll be watch your email for details on how to get that to you as well. Excellent. We love giving away books, and we're so grateful for all of you to have joined us. And Karen, welcome for the last little bit. So have a wonderful time, and watch out for more notifications for future webinars.
Thanks.